Hi, this is the second lesson on human evolution. And in this lesson, I want us to try and focus on some of the causes of this rapid evolution of hominins that's led to our own species, Homo sapiens. For this lesson, you're going to need the human evolution worksheet that has the colour graphs on it. Okay, let's go. This graph is really important. It shows us the climatic history over about the last 9 million years or so. This is derived from oxygen isotope data, and it shows some clear patterns in the climatic change over recent geological time. What we need to consider is how this can be linked to human evolution. Think about what the trends are here. What's this graph actually telling us about the climate? I think there are two key messages that come out of this graph. The first, perhaps most obviously, is that the climate is cooling over this period of time, particularly over the last 4 million years or so, reflecting the change to the glacial periods that are characteristic of the Quaternary in the last 2 million years. But it's not just the fact that the climate is cooling. We can see that there's instability within the climate, but that instability, that variability within the climate, seems to be increasing. There's a greater gap between the higher points and the lower points on this curve as we get to more recent time. That presents a whole series of challenges for organisms. And it perhaps suggests why humans have evolved as they have. Let's explore that in a little more detail. If we think about the effect of environment on human evolution, if we have a fairly stable habitat, what effect's that going to have on human population? Not just in numbers, but particularly in terms of any evolutionary change. Will we see rapid change as a result of this? If we have a progressive change, as we've just seen, perhaps going from a warmer climate to a colder climate, what impact do you think that would have on a human population? What evolutionary changes would we see as a result of a progressive habitat change? If we think about that progressive change, that would lead to a genetic funneling, I suppose, of particular adaptations. Say, for example, it was becoming cooler, you might have the progressive selection of adaptations that are better suited to a cooler climate. Okay, hairier hominins, for example, because this progressive change is going to be selective of particular adaptations. If we throw in a different model, though, where we have a variable habitat, where we're seeing big fluctuations and rapid fluctuations in the environment, what's that going to do? Clearly, one particular adaptation may not be advantageous over a long period of time. We won't get that progressive selection of particular characteristics. What impact do you think this would have? Perhaps what we'll see is actually a selection of features that favour adaptability. If organisms can adapt to this fluctuating environment, can develop behaviours, will select particular features that allow for organisms to adapt to this unstable environment, it's going to pick out particular things. Let's have a look at some of the evidence for this. This is a map showing the migration of early hominins out of eastern Africa, where the earliest ones evolved. We have various different fossil sites across Africa and southern Asia with their dates. What's interesting is when we start to look at the environmental conditions that existed at the time these fossils were preserved. Because that perhaps would show us what evidence we might have for this idea of variability selection. So we have this place, Demanisi, that has grassland surrounded by mountains and forests. You've got lava as a source of tools. Nuehan is a lake with lots of changes in vegetation, forests to grasslands. It could have been quite arid as well. Yuanmu has an ancient lake as well, a mixture of different habitats. And down in Java there are grasslands, rivers, marine coastal environments, all in the tropics. So each of these sites that preserve fossils from about the same type of age have quite different environments, and perhaps as well changing environments that the hominins that lived in these locations had to cope with. If we look at one site, we can see evidence of this change. This is a very famous location in Kenya, Ologasale. We find evidence here in East Africa of human activity from 1.2 million years ago up to about 400,000 years ago. And it's interesting to see how the hominins have adapted to the changes that we see reflected in the geology. If we look at the geological section here, within a relatively thin section of sediments, in this pit here you're seeing what, maybe 1.5 meters worth of sediments. We have the environment changing from a dry grassland to a wet grassland to some volcanic activity. We then have a lake sediment followed by a drought followed by a deep lake. There are various volcanic ash layers in here as well. It shows an unstable, fluctuating environment. If we look at the response of other mammals, not the hominins, of other mammals that we find fossilized in the same site that clearly lived within this environment, up to about 600,000 years ago, there were species of zebra that was a specialized adaptation for eating grass, a baboon, a ground-living baboon, again, that consumed grass, and a water-dwelling hippo. After 600,000 years, we see change. We see an evolutionary development, a different type of zebra that was able to not just feed on grass, but could also feed on leaves and other vegetation. A different type of baboon that was omnivorous, that could move in the trees and on the ground. And another type of hippo that was able to move between water sources. So we can see that these other mammals have responded to the climatic changes by evolving whole new species. And interestingly, species that were adapted to cope with a more varied environment. But throughout all of this, the hominins survived. They didn't become extinct. They adapted to these changes. If we think about how hominins actually do this, we come back to the idea of brain, and particularly the size of the brain. This is something we can calculate through looking at the brain cavity space within fossils. We can see that over time, and through the different hominin species shown by the different colours and symbols on this graph, that brain size has increased. But it hasn't just increased in terms of volume. Humans or hominins over this time also increased in body size. So you'd expect a bigger organism to have a bigger brain. This is more than that, though, because the vertical axis on this graph shows us the percentage of the body that's actually occupied by the brain. So this accounts for a changing body size. What we're seeing over this time period is that the proportion of the body occupied by the brain is increasing the percentage of that body. So that it's not just that the body's getting bigger, but the brain is getting bigger still. Perhaps maybe 3 times the size relative to body mass over a 3 million year period. We have freakishly large brains for our bodies. Let's think about what that actually means in terms of human abilities, human variability. So this graph shows us that our brains are getting increasingly large, an increasingly large proportion of our body. Something we, by the way, have to take, there is a biological cost to that, particularly in terms of the stage of development at which we're born, because to accommodate this very large brain and to be able to get it out of through a female pelvis, we have to be born at a very early stage. That's why we're so helpless when we're first born. But these larger brains allow humans to process and store information, much as I hope you're doing at the moment. To be able to plan ahead, to be able to anticipate any problems, to communicate with each other, where you might be sharing information, or in the dry times before my ancestors found fruit in the next valley across. That could be one of the advantages that communication would give. And to develop new technologies, new ways of coping with this environmental variability. And, I hope very much, to be able to solve abstract problems. To be able to think through the challenges of survival. We can see this when we start to look at the technology that humans were able to develop, that moved on in really a very short period of time through a whole series of developments that allowed them to cope, to get the food, the shelter, the water that they needed to survive. And the rate of that change just increased over time. We see brain size increasing slowly up to maybe about 1 million years ago. Following that, though, and interestingly correlating with the period of greatest climatic fluctuation, we see a rapid increase in the proportion of our body that's occupied by the brain. These evolutionary changes lead to a whole host of adaptive benefits. We can change our environment, we can control our environment, we can develop new ways of coping with change. All as a result of this increasing variability of the environment and the growth in brain size that spurred in human evolution. So, as we watch the sunset on the African Rift Valley, and we think about conclusions in Swahili there, it's an interesting theory, but one I think that's supported by a great deal of evidence. What do you think? Are there any other bits of evidence that we could get from the fossil record?